what he's done as a poet, coming from a particular generation of poets who were coming into their own in a very strange time in post-independence India, when the English language, given given colonial history, was looked upon with skepticism as a language of creativity and with prejudice for political reasons. So that's the kind of generation which began to do something new in the English language. Of course, there were English language poets before in India who were producing a kind of Indian poetry and a kind of idea of India through that Indian poetry, whether it was somebody like Sarojini Naidu or Aurobindo. Now these people seem to cut themselves off deliberately from those forebears and then begin to write in this kind of period of transition. But the most, I would say, the most self-aware of them, in that the kind of contingency of his practice, the peculiarity of his practice, the most self-aware of them is Arvind Krishna Mehrotra. He took what he was doing least for granted, and that is reflected, this openness as well as not taking for granted anything in the career as an anthologist, as an essayist, as a critic, as an editor, so as a translator. So none of these kind of facets are simply the facets of a talented man exercising different parts of his talent at different points of time, but the kind of experiments of a man who belongs to a peculiar moment of transition and takes nothing for granted. So let me begin to then ask Arvind about what you've been doing for all these decades. You begin to write poetry in your teens, is that right? How literary is the kind of milieu or ethos in which you grew up?
Yeah, so I realized, as I'm sitting here and Amit is talking about when I started writing, I realized to my horror that it's 50 years, almost 50 years. And sometimes I sort of look back and I said, no, this can't be possible. But it is, but that's exactly what it is. I think I started writing in 64, 65. And by 65, we already had a magazine called Damn You, a Magazine of the Arts, from Allahabad. And that would be exactly 50 years ago, almost to the day. Now, 50 years ago, the landscape of Indian literature, or literature in English on the subcontinent, it was a very different landscape. It was a landscape in which English was really going out of the system. And by system, I mean it was going out of the educational system completely. There was, just before that, the Angrezi Hatao Andolans in Uttar Pradesh, where I was studying at the time and where I still live. And overnight, the number plates of the cars were from English, they became Hindi. Your nameplates became in Hindi. The shop signs overnight were all in Hindi. And here was me and a couple of my friends trying to write poems in English. There was nothing more stupid that you could have done in 1964 or 1965. And everyone said, why are you doing this? I said, there will be no English very soon. Give it another 2 years or 3 years, at most 5 years. There were no magazines either. There was nothing. There was nothing that if you were writing in English, you didn't know what to do with yourself. And the tradition you mentioned, we read a bit of Sarojini Naidu, probably because in the courses she was there. Aurobindo one had vaguely heard of. But other than that, there was P. Lal in Calcutta. There was always P. Lal in Calcutta. But other than that, there were a couple of poets, Nissim Ezekiel in Bombay, that one had heard about. But apart from Ezekiel, Lal, who was there in my generation of poets anywhere, from Allahabad, I couldn't find a single person who was 16 years old and who was trying to write poetry in English. So I think the question then became, if you are writing poetry in English, where do you belong? What's the literary culture to which this poetry is contributing to? And since there was very little contemporary Indian poetry in English, one kind of put together a tradition of one's own as one went along. I think that's what since we did, see now when you write a novel in English today, you have Amit Chaudhuri, and before the Amit Chaudhuri you have someone else, and before that you have someone. So there is a whole tradition of the English novel, at least from R.K. Narayan to Amit Chaudhuri and to younger writers. So if a young writer is trying to write a first novel, there is a tradition that the young writer can look back on. He can see, well, my work fits in with X's work or Y's work. I'm continuing with that tradition or this tradition. But in 1965, if you're 15 or 16 years old, what tradition are you taking forward? And what tradition have you inherited? And what tradition are you taking forward? So there was neither a tradition you have inherited, and since you have inherited no tradition, there is no tradition that you can then take forward. So then we had to put together a tradition of our own. And the Americans, I think, and the French had a lot to contribute to this, I call it tradition, but there was, it was not our tradition, in the sense that it was not our national tradition to be writing like surrealists or to be writing like the American beat poets. But that is how we tried to, at least some of us, tried to put together a working tradition. And it was also, I think I must point out, that it was a time when we were also seeking a language. To be writing in English was not good enough, but what English? Because the English we were coming out of was the English of the colonial educational system. And we couldn't write like Shelley or Tennyson or, but that's where a new linguistic strain entered our consciousness in the form of Allen Ginsberg or Ferlinghetti, the beat poets, that you could use your spoken voice in order to write poetry. So there is this great line in one of Ginsberg's poems, America, go fuck yourself with your atom bomb. Now, that anyone could write America, go fuck yourself with your atom bomb for a 15-year-old was a great revelation. I never imagined that this too could be poetry. Poetry was the Skylark, Ode to a Nightingale, or Ode to Autumn. But suddenly you have this, or Ferlinghetti having a poem called Underwear, with a line like, the Pope wears underwear, I hope. So you could write a poem about fuck yourself with atom bomb, about the Pope's underwear. So these were the new things, and then you could have the French surrealists, you had André Breton, you had the Dadaists, as was pointed out yesterday. So out of this very strange mix of the French surrealists and the American beat poets, that one tried to create some kind, E. Cummings, so we all wrote in lowercase. That was the good thing to do. And the fools use capital letters and then at the beginning of sentences. So it was out of this, what can only call a khichdi, that we created some kind of a working tradition. But all this is hindsight also. No, I don't know if any of this was happening, when we were actually 15 years old and writing.
Two questions in relation to that. Was there something about the time that was making translations of those French poets that you're talking about, or the Dadaists, and the work of the beat poets, available, but also available in this, it's in a much more immediate way than the works works of other poets in other Anglophone or other cultures? Was there something about the time? And also, in what way were they becoming available to you in Allahabad?
I think we have to thank Penguin Books for Penguin Modern Poets. Volume 5 had Ginsberg, Corso, and Ferlinghetti, 2 shillings 6 pence. It was quite, for a couple of 3-4 rupees. The same with Baudelaire, Enid Starkey or someone's prose, the prose translations of Baudelaire's poems became available, and then Grove Press made some of the surrealists available. I think.
So these books were imported into India,
yes, they were imported into India, and bookshops had these books. I have to say that we could buy all these books in Allahabad. So I think all my early reading, Yevtushenko was available. Suddenly a few Russian poets started becoming available.
So why let us say the beat poets rather than say Robert Lowell or Philip Larkin? What was it that at that point of time drew you to the beat poets?
I think Lowell I may not have been aware of at all, though I did buy Donald Hall's American Poetry, I think, or New American Poetry, a small anthology by Donald Hall. But I think Philip Larkin was not part of one's consciousness then. For some strange reason, that was basically what we got through Penguin Books. And I think it was more than that. It was the immediacy of the language of the beat poets.
Did Allahabad, Arvind, have a USIS, American Center? Did it have British Council?
No. We had none of that in Allahabad. We still don't. It was basically bookshops. Basically bookshops, and my uncle, received copies. He was an English professor, and the Americans were trying to promote literature, American literature. In the subcontinent, and they would send free American magazines and books.
What about the Hindi poets? Like this is the other language you know well, and you've also translated wonderfully from the Hindi poets. I mean, also from Prakrit, etc. So what was going on over there?
I think what happened, which was hugely important for us at the time, I'm talking of the late 60s, not 65 as much as 67, 68, 69, by which time I had moved to Bombay. I had spent 2 years in Bombay from 66 to 68. And around that time, Adil Jasawala was asked by Penguin to edit new writing in India. And for the first time, that's what brought me into translating from the Hindi. He asked me to translate a couple of a short story and a couple of poems. And that's for the first time we realized that there were others like us writing in the different Indian languages. And that again, there was suddenly, who was a much older person, like Shakti Chattopadhyay's poems were there from Bangla, Ravji Patel in Gujarati. Arun Kolhatkar, of course, one knew, but there were some of Arun Kolhatkar's poems, or Dilip Chitre's poems. Some of these people one knew, but a lot of the writers, Tamil poets were there, a couple of Tamil poets, and they wrote exactly as we wanted to write. Then one realized that what this new writing in India was not just simply being done by us in English, but this new writing was far more widespread, and similar things with probably similar influences were taking place in different parts of the country.
So it had to come through that direction. Yes. So nothing in your school education pointed towards how exciting Indian writing might be.
No, I think the school education, as anyone who's been through the Indian school or indeed the university system, we still don't know. Yes, we still do not teach modern Indian literature in the English departments. So no one going through the school or university education would ever dream, would ever come across this these modernist traditions within Indian literature.
Right. So now when you talk about doing that translation or those translations for Adil Jasawala, we are talking about what, 1970?
Yes, 1969, 70, 71.
1969, 70, 71. So So, but by then, Arvind, you've already evolved yourself as a poet from your 17-year-old self or 16-year-old self, the person who had read the beats and the other people on a particular in a particular kind of American scene at the time, and had responded with "Damn you," to "Fuck you," and had responded with "Bharat Mata," a prayer. You had written all of that, you'd done all of that, but then you evolve into a poet, and certain other kind of parameters beyond the beats become visible in your work. So of course there is the French surrealists, but there is also a compression in your work, a new compression in your work, quite different, let us say, from Bharat Mata. And also, in spite of the surrealism of the early poems, there's an attention to the detail of life in small town India. And so you are also obviously responding by now to other poets like Pound or William Carlos Williams, maybe. You know, there are other people on your mind by this time. What is going on over there? What's developing to make you that different person by 69 or 70?
You know, I think you know, the small town and the small town detail, I think, was there even in Bharat Mata, because there the small town was a small town in central India, which is largely forgotten, a place called Bhilai, the Bhilai steel plant. And there I listed all the small, all the things which I had, which a middle class home in a steel town would have, like Bershin cooking gas. There was no Indane, so there was Bershin cooking gas, there was a refrigerator, there was a cooler, there was no air conditioning. Now, when I look back and I read Bharat Mata, so one was listing the objects around one, not making any great poetry out of it, but the poetry was in the list, so long as you could enumerate them. So the attempt to pin down the small town life would have been there at the other end of Bharat Mata's Bombay. So there is Industry House and Samovar and the Jahangir Art Gallery on one end. On the other hand, in the same poem, Bharat Mata, that Amit is talking about, written in 1965 or 66, there is also Bhilai and the steel plant being described. But I think the change that you were talking about came not, I was trying to, write in this vatic, long lines, slightly free voice. And I think I reached the dead end of that voice very quickly. It's like you were saying yesterday, that there was this Gibran and there was the Tagore of Gitanjali, and this kind of a young man's angst, being expressed in these. In this way, Whitman perhaps. But then I realized that my skill did not lie in continuing to write like this for the rest of my life. And what I really should do is to change that whole strategy. And all this is, again, unconscious hindsight and all the rest of it. And suddenly start and bring more concision and more precision, a more natural way of speaking rather than speaking from on high. Instead of taking a bird's eye view of things, from the top, you look at things from the ground, and I think all of us have what you called yesterday the Saint Cyril Road moment. You had it, Naipaul had it famously, when he realized what I'm talking about is that the young writer wants to capture the whole world. And Naipaul has written about this very beautifully, that how he wasted so many years of his life trying to write like a writer. He had this idea that a great writer, this is how a great writer writes. So if you're doing your diary, you would sort of look back as a 20-year-old and say, would Tolstoy be writing like this? And there were so many things Naipaul said that he left out of his experience because he felt that this was not a great writer's. This experience is not worth having for a great, or worth writing about. What will people say? So that is the St. Cyril Road moment. And when you actually look out the window and you see, well, that is what I have to write about. That is the only thing I can write about. There's nothing else. So Naipaul, in his mind, hears Miguel Street. He hears the first sentence, Hat is sitting across the road, and someone says, hi, Hat, what you doing, man? And that man replies. And that is the beginning of Naipaul's first published book. That is the beginning of Miguel Street, which is suddenly sitting in London, hearing a voice in Trinidad. And that voice comes back to him, and he says that is what captures that moment for him. And so my St. Cyril Road moment was when, when I suddenly thought I would introduce my uncle in a poem and his wheelchair. He was an invalid. He had multiple sclerosis. And I decided, this was 69, 70, and I decided to include some of the books in his library. I decided to actually say Ruskin's Lectures on Art and a short history of English literature by Legway. And that, I think, I realized that you could actually say these things, but it took me about 4 years of writing to realize that I could mention my father, who was a dentist. I could mention his surgery. I could mention the roads of Allahabad. I could mention Thornhill and Hastings and Lytton, which are the three roads now that, it took me a long time, 4 years of struggle, to actually put these names down on the page. That is, so I mean, it's an experience that all of us, a lot of us have, been through. At least you have been through it, Naipaul has been through it, and I certainly have been through it.
Yeah. No, that's exactly what I was wondering about, because although you say you enumerate certain things in that list in Bharat Mata Prayer, there's suddenly in the poem, maybe you're referring to the sale.
Sale and continuities.
There's this great kind of radical sort of excitement over there in the way things are being brought together. Some of the things you mentioned, the names of books, maybe a figure, and place names, and surrealist conceits. They're all being brought together in a new way, which is inviting us to again think of how to read the poem. With Bharat Mata, we already know to a certain extent how to receive the poem. We've been prepared by the beats. Over here, we are not wholly prepared for this kind of mix of things. So I suppose that's what I wanted to get to, how this moment occurs. The other thing I want to ask you over here is, as you now begin to write and then explore and extend, and in many ways also stick to some of the essentials of your style of writing, which have to do with leaving things out, compression, etc. As you embark on this, in maybe 69 or wherever, beginning to write continuities and the sale, you and others like Jasawala, there is Nissim Ezekiel already, and various others, all well-known poets from this group of poets. You decide that, it seems, maybe not consciously, that you're not going to be anxious about a number of things. So there's a lack of anxiety in a sense about maybe the audience or the critic or what, I don't know, but there's a lack of anxiety about the fact that you are writing about this in a relatively private and new language about your milieu or the environment that you know, and that you are unanxious for that point of time by the fact that by the idea of what is an authentic Indian tongue. You're an Indian, you're writing in English. How then do I buttress it in some way to justify it, not only politically but creatively? Since we grew up in that generation where we were told that we had to dream in the language we wrote in, the mother tongue, etc. So there is no anxiety. You often, of course, write about dreams, especially in that period. There's no anxiety to somehow to throw out gestures. That don't worry, I'm doing this. This tongue has its kind of justifications, creative and political. And connected to that, the anxiety to do with other kinds of environments, intellectual environments. From I would say, maybe, the moment of independence, with Nehru's emphasis on the social sciences and on science. Uh, Literature was kind of rather a weird occupation. On top of this, some people, especially later on, much more into the 90s, people felt that they need to justify what they were doing by making it a kind of quasi-science or document in some way. So again, there's no anxiety about that, or having to somehow address the themes, not literary themes, but themes to do with India that are important. It's not there in you, it's not there in Adil, it's not there in Kolatkar. It's a joint, maybe individual, but congruent kind of decision to be, in a sense, very uncompromising about the literary. That the literary is a multiple kind of thing is evident from the variety of voices, even in the people I've mentioned, that there is no one thing which we mean by that this is recognized to be literary. But this is a great determination, which may or may not be conscious, to not compromise in this enterprise as one tries to explore what poetry might be, written by people like yourself. Again, I'm interested in what's going on over here.
Yeah, I think one thing that all this is not happening deliberately. We didn't sit down and plan a manifesto or decide this is what we're going to do. We sometimes did not meet for at least for a year. I was in Allahabad, my friends were in. But the nation, as it came to exist in later fiction particularly, did not exist in our minds. We were free of this idea of the nation. It really didn't bother me whether I was an Indian or where I was living or there was what's happening to the country. I think and so it was with Arun Kolatkar. He was writing about the boat ride from Gateway of India on a little steamer towards Elephanta and coming back. The bigness did not strike any of us. Or in one poem which he translates into English as 3 Cups of Tea, he's picking up Bombay street language and putting it straight into a poem. He was not even translating it into proper Hindi or Marathi. Now, I think if you look at the aesthetics of it, it will probably come from William Carlos Williams, that it is the aesthetics of the small, the aesthetics of the minor, the aesthetics of, and Kolatkar was, of course, the master of this, the aesthetics of the unimportant or the insignificant. And he carried it, his journey is the most remarkable of all, just because he continued with this to the end of his life. He continued looking at really the rubbish on the street and converting that into great poetry. And literally itemizing, sometimes he actually itemizes the objects he finds in a rubbish heap, which is swept up by the sweeper in the morning outside the Jahangir Gallery. He calls them installation 1, installation 2. But I think throughout the 60s and 70s, during the great decades of nation building, the nation somehow did not enter the picture of entered our consciousness. And how that happened, I think I think that did not happen because we were obsessed not with the nation. I think we were obsessed with literature. And so literature is what we were trying to create rather than trying to create a nation through literature.
What about something authentic? You were not trying to do that either.
No, because I think we thought that if we can...
You look back, it's quite extraordinary. That you were not trying to... of course, your poems wouldn't be read now if you had done that, except as historical curiosities. But that you were not trying to give us if the 70s poets' version of what is most authentic about their surrounding. This is not what you were trying to do. You were trying to, in fact, configure various things in the poetry. So, and you were presuming that there would be somebody who would understand that the configuration and the play were of interest somehow, and the fact that you are not doing certain things which is expected of a poet and a poet writing in English would also somehow be understood. So a lot was being taken for granted there.
Amit, I think what the question was always being posed about what you hinted at. Can you be an authentic Indian voice if you are writing in English? And it was put to the novelists, but even more directly to the poets. Because poets were somehow closer, the burden of authenticity. No one asked Nayantara Sehgal or Anita Desai if they were authentic Indian voices. But the poets was always asked this completely ridiculous question, because the mother tongue and mother's milk somehow went together. And we never, we never got English from our mother's milk, that's for sure. But that question didn't bother, at least me personally, and probably didn't bother the other people you mentioned, because we were living in India. We were living in India, and we took the India we were writing about for granted, and we took authenticity for granted. I'm saying if you're trying to write a poem, you're trying to write an authentic poem, and that authenticity of the work of literature will take care of the other authenticities. That you do not then have to step out of the literary moment and chase a moment called authenticity.
But the term Indianness was also being sort of used by someone like Nissim Ezekiel. That is it Indian enough? Does it show Indianness? Am I right? Wasn't he preoccupied with that to a certain extent? Or I remember him saying of certain kind of. Well, I actually remember him coming to a competition hosted by Elphinstone College. This was, I think, at the end of the 70s, 78, where he was the judge, and it was all pretty bad. It was a drama competition or a performance competition. It was all quite bad, and there was one person who now, by the way, is an organizer himself, not of literary festivals but of cultural events, called Ranveer Shah, in Chennai. The young Ranveer Shah acted as a beggar and did a kind of mime. Now he went to the stage and laid into everybody, Nissim Ezekiel, saying that it was very bad and it was not Indian enough. The only person who had done something which was, in a way, Indian enough was this Ranveer Shah, who had mimed the beggar. Again, I mean, this doesn't seem to have ever been a preoccupation as far as you're concerned.
No. This I don't know what made Nissim say that, but but again in '78, I don't know what would he have been thinking about what was Indian enough, but Indianness never. No, that idea and the idea of authenticity, the idea of the mother tongue, and one always thought, and which is what I started imagining in 1981, that authenticity or Indianness would come in through the other tongue that you always have. Someone tried to develop the idea that if you have two languages, as all of us in India do, so if you're writing in English, but you have Bangla as your other language, or you have Hindi, then in some ways that other language will provide you with two ways of looking at the world, which I call the bilingual imagination. And the bilingual imagination, so through the bilingual imagination, this other thing that people keep talking about will happen on its own. You don't have to go after it. It is already built into the imagination.
Having said this, this group you're a part of, which at that point was a fledgling tradition of Indian poets writing in English. And of course there were various others who were writing poetry in English, who don't then make it into your anthology. The anthology which you would edit 12 modern, the Oxford India anthology of 12 modern Indian poets. Now that anthology is a kind of intervention and a statement where you're making a case for this tradition. You know, in spite of your lack of anxiety, yet there seems to be a sense leading up to the anthology that are we or are we not more than individuals writing individual poems, good poems. And you quote Paz to say that any literary tradition, you do that in your Emperor Has No Clothes essay, has to be more than a collection of good poems and presumably of good writers. That there has to be a field of relations which adds up to any tradition. By the time you're editing this anthology, you're asking yourself the question, it seems to me, that are we more than a bunch of, some of us, good writers? Some of the bad ones I'm not going to put in the anthology, but some of these good writers. But just putting good writers in an anthology is not enough for you. You want there to be a field of relations coming out of or inhering in what you've chosen and even the poems you've chosen. A collection of good poems is also not going to do. So do you want to tell us something about that moment?
You know, 1970, when did I? 1992, I think I did this Oxford Indian Anthology of 12 modern Indian poets. A little before that, maybe 4 or 5 years before that, Rukun Advani at Oxford University Press had asked me to edit this. When I started looking at the poets to include, I also had to introduce each poet with a page and a half or 2-page introduction. Now, which made it very difficult for me to write on poets I did not like. So, you know, how do you write? I couldn't accept them on their reputation. So for instance, R. Parthasarathi, with whom I had great disagreements, there were some poets I included because I liked some of their poems, but I may not have liked everything, but I still wanted to say something about their poems. So for instance, Keki Daruwala, who's never forgiven me for writing, I think, in that his poems are like newspaper reports sometimes. And he's basically giving you news. Of a famine somewhere, of a flood somewhere.
It's the kind of stuff you say that teleprinters are constantly busy with.
Yes, that's what
something like
yes,
that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's I think that's the phrase I use, and he still mentions it. He still mentions it in some review he's doing. He'll go out of his way to mention that, you know, Mehrotra in his anthology, you know, he said these nasty things about a lot of the poets. Nissim Ezekiel, you know, I also. So I think part of when I was trying to carve out of tradition. That is very what was very clear in my mind. And the way to carve out a tradition was to also include poems and poets you don't like, as much as you like some of the others. But then you go out and stick your neck out and say why you don't like these poets and what are the reasons for your not liking them. And that is how I realized that, you know, that if we had 91, 92 when this anthology comes out, so one has already been at it through the 60s, 70s and 80s. So at least for 20 years, one sees something forming, something taking shape. So there is Kolhatkar. There is a younger poet like Aga Shahid Ali, you know, who comes from America. And Shahid Ali, I don't know how familiar you are with Aga Shahid Ali's work over here, but he's one of the finest poets to have emerged out of after our generation. Then there was Manohar Shetty. There was Eunice D'Souza, who had not been really anthologized until then, because the woman poet was Kamala Das. And I couldn't really write about Kamala Das because I didn't respond to her work as much as I did to Eunice's work. Because in Eunice's work, you started hearing the local idiom, which you don't always hear in Kamala Das. You don't hear the Goan Catholic Bandra idiom as you do in Eunice's poems, in anyone's poems. So I think that voice had to be put in the anthology. And other voices which one did not like so much, one either left them out or one included them only to damn some of them.
Like whom?
Like Nissim and partly Jayant Mahapatra. Because all of Jayant Mahapatra's poems, to me, they sound the same. I'm sorry, they could be the same poem. I mean, whether he wrote it, 30 years ago or he's writing it today, there are certain images will keep happening decade after decade, and book after book. And I wanted to point them out. I wanted just to say that, look here, Jayant Mahapatra has written so much, he's probably a very good poet, but then, these are the problems I have with Jayanta, with Kolatkar, with Daruwala and with Nissim. I think these are and other poets are just left out.
See, as far as those poets are concerned, I mean, you reprimand Nissim Ezekiel and reprimand Daruwala. You don't actually reprimand Jayanta, but then you also alert us to what is interesting in their work and what is therefore interesting in the tradition. But with your head note to Jayanta Mahapatra, what's happening there, and maybe it's happening in some of the other ones, in the case of poets you like as well, is that you are also being tested, that you are trying to reformulate. So you are not the kind of poet with your kind of fidelity, let us say, to Pound, to the image, etc., to somebody who is deliberately repeating themselves, and as Mahapatra is doing. And so you are in a way being tested by Mahapatra, and I think you respond quite well. You try to come up with a language with which to speak about him, and you realize that the language of speaking about Aga Shahid Ali or Jasawala or Kolatkar is not going to do with Mahapatra. You can't respond to Mahapatra in that way, and you can't then just simply berate him for not being Aga Shahid Ali or Kolatkar or whoever. So you come up with the sentence which I do like very much, where you quote Pound and talk about Pound, always advised against mixing up the concrete and the abstract. What is the example that Pound gives us of that?
He says, don't use a phrase like dim lands of peace.
Dim lands of peace.
So don't mix the abstract and the concrete.
Yeah. So don't never mix the abstract and the concrete. Arvind says Mahapatra is a master of mixing the abstract and the concrete. Now this is a person, I think here, Mehrotra, the critic, responding to something, and as a challenge that the poet is doing something more than me just simply dismissing him for not doing the kind of things I'd like him to do, and to find a language. So over here in this anthology, what you're doing on again and again is, I think, trying to find a language to speak about elements in the tradition which you may not be drawn to automatically, but also trying to speak about the tradition itself. How does one talk about even the people you like in a way that is not stupid? Because so much of that has been done. So much of the praise, in fact, about 99.9% of the praise is unreadable because it doesn't say anything. So this is what you're trying to do: how to praise, but also through that, how to speak plausibly, persuasively about the tradition. And do you want to say something about that, or?
No, I think. No, I don't. About Jayanta, the tradition was always, I think, with that anthology.
Not just Jayanta,
No, but with that anthology, one did try and create a small tradition. You see, when we're talking of poetry, we are already talking a very marginal thing, and Indian poetry in English even gets smaller. Now, within that smallness, how to formulate some kind of tradition that is actually also a break from the tradition that we inherited from Nissim Ezekiel. Nissim Ezekiel also, for me, became someone to rebel against. That this is because there is a flatness to his line, which still I still find very jarring. There is a plainness to it. One was certainly trying to put together a textbook of do's and don'ts, in Poundian terms. Do this and don't do that. So there was this, now that you mention it, that don't write like Ezekiel, or these are the problems with Ezekiel, don't mix the abstract with the concrete as Jayant Mahatra does. But at the same time, one did try to understand what he meant by rain, what he meant by door, you know, what he
by individual words in the poems.
Individual words. What do these words mean? Because he cannot write, this is the abstract and the concrete. He will use door, but then the door will, all sorts of very strange things will happen till the door will disappear into nothingness.
Yes.
And so, you know.
There is no concrete
No,
door.
there is no, I think what door is, you know, if it either, does it open, does it remain shut, does something happen? But then he goes off into some other world altogether.
Okay, before I ask you to read a few of your poems, the last question I'd ask you is, you know, you write as a poet without anxiety. As an anthologist and a critic as well, you're making a case as if somebody's listening, you know, as if it matters. Now, the fact being that so few are listening within India and outside it, what does that matter to you, and what's your kind of, what do you think?
You know, I mean, you know, it's not that thousands of people are going to read any of this, especially the poetry anthology or a book of poems. A few hundred people will read it. And a few hundred people, those who have read that poetry anthology, it did kind of, I still hear from people saying that they started writing so after they read that. You know, poets, at least 3 or 4 poets who are now fairly well known have told me that they had never dreamt of writing poetry in English, but once they read that anthology, they thought, well, they too could, they should start writing. So I think one just feels happy when one hears this, that, you know, that it's been taught in colleges, I've been prescribed at a few places perhaps, but also it's been helpful to writers who are starting out to write, and they didn't know, you know, what to read, or, you know, no one to tell them that this is how you do it or you don't do it.
But you've tried to kind of, what you've tried to do, what some of us have tried to do, but you of course, is correct this kind of lopsided celebration of literature, which has been happening in the last 20 years. Now, do you want to say something about what is this lopsided celebration? What is going on over here?
You know, what is going on? What has been going on for a very long time, which is the complete absence of the literary critic, as there is no dominant literary critic writing in English in India at the moment, and we cannot have a literature without someone actually saying that this is good and this is bad, this is why you should read so and so, this is why you should ignore so and so. So what is happening is that I've seen writers talk about it, that even reviewers look at the first 2 reviews that come out, and then everyone starts repeating what the first 2 reviewers have said. So I think part of the problem arises because we do not have any critic that the whole country, like in England you had, we all know the names, but that the whole country respects as a literary critic. And that whole profession of criticism, I think, has never existed in any serious way. So it's been left to the poets to write the poem, to anthologize, and to become the critics.
Do you want to read 3 maybe short poems? Yeah.
These are 2 poems which I had read yesterday, and I'll read them again, or I'll read 3 short poems. They're all written over the last 3-4 years, and this is called "They'll Ride Out Any Storm." And this is about a man who has a stall, a roadside stall, where you buy your linen, your bed sheets, bed covers, hangings. We all know the kind of stalls that I'm talking about. For the past 5 years, from a market stall, he sold hand towels, bed linen, cheap ready-mades, and smiley wall hangings. I've come to like this man From a passing cart laden with disco papayas, he once helped me choose a sweet one. The last time I saw him, there was a summer dust storm blowing, and while everyone else ran for cover, he was fast asleep on a pile of machine washable export quality scatter rugs. This is called washing tub. My hands bubble wrapped in soap suds. I wash in a plastic tub my sando vest. And here on other terraces, young mothers talking. It is morning, and before me is open the book of sunsets. I'll come to the end of the page, and there aren't many pages remaining. How do I tell the mothers it was a slim book to start with? And the last poem, I spend most of my time in Dehradun, and it's one of the Dehradun poems. And one day I was in the evening. It had rained, and I saw a hoopoe. After a long time, I saw a hoopoe pecking in the dust, as hoopos tend to do. So this is called hoopoe. Who remembers my dentist father now that even his patients are dead? A hoopoe pecks at the sodden ground beside the latched gate, on which is hung a rusted signboard with his name and clinic hours, the letters illegible and getting more so. Like a spark of fire in the air, the hoopoes vanished into the trees, leaving the patch of earth a little dark where it came looking for grubs. It's been raining. We belong to the houses we live in.
Lovely.
Thank you.
I think maybe we might have time for a couple of questions. I'm not an expert at kind of timekeeping or any of this, but in case somebody wants to ask a question, yeah. Do you have a mic?
I'm Favorish Devnath, poet. I want to know about the book of King Bruce.
Bruce King?
Yeah, Bruce King in English, Indian poetry.
You want to know something about Bruce King's book, what Arvind feels about it?
Well, you know, Bruce King, he wrote the first book, and that's still a very useful, a very worthwhile book to have, because he...
The critical study, you mean, of
Indian poetry in English. The first, 1980s, I think, or 1990s, 1980s. And no one had come out to knocking on our doors. This is not the kind of thing Indians would do. Indians don't do research of this kind. You know, but here's this very big, large, fat American professor who comes all the way from Alabama or wherever he came from, comes all the way to Allahabad sitting on the back of a rickshaw. He finds my house, and he does it he goes to Cuttack, he finds where Jayant Mahatra is, goes to Bombay, meets Jasawala, meets Kolatkar, meets everyone, and just records meticulously the dates and the time and when we were at a certain moment and what our publications were, when did the little magazine appear. So for that, and it's not a very critical book. He doesn't have a very critical mind. He generally says very nice things about everyone, but he does he does put certain things on the map, and that is still useful to have, and a lot of people consult it. And if you want to know what was happening in 1968, how will you know what was happening in 1968? But he also provides you with with that kind of timeline. So that's it's still very useful.
Another question? Okay, there and then.
I'm Shamsudzaman, attached with the media. Who is the first Indian to write English poem? Who is the first Indian to write English poem? Thank you.
I think the first Indian would be Derozio, Henry Louis Vivian Derozio, in the 1820s.
There's another question over there. An expert on Derozio.
two quick questions, Arvind. One is to do with, you know, what you've been talking about for some time, this notion of a field, of relationships, of hammering out a tradition from, you know, something that was very disparate, disconnected, isolated almost. You've been speaking about it, the two of you. I was wondering whether you wanted to say something more perhaps about the enabling aspect of, you know, being what I would call a minor literature, being subculture, being somehow subterranean, being under the main, you know, nation's structure, not engaging with all of that. So that was, you know, or you may not want to reflect on it. That's okay. The other one actually was more specific and had to do with what you call bilingualism. And you said over there, and you've said this in that essay, and I've read the essay, but what you said here as well, that for the bilingual person, you have the English language and you have the mother tongue, or the, you know, Bangla, and that the Bangla or Hindi gives you that other world, you said. That other world, however, so the authentic can always be, you know, is always there in that other language, the second language, and you have English. 2 points quickly. One is that, of course, that's in more or less in direct contradiction to what you yourself say in Emperor Has No Clothes. That there is no subterranean sort of, you know, one's own language with the mother's milk that one excavates in order to write one's poetry in English. The other is, of course, a point that you've already been discussing, that the authentic in that way does not, of course, surprisingly reside in that mother tongue at all. You know, the practices in the mother tongue are surprisingly diverse and cosmopolitan and modern. So just stray thoughts that came out of the conversation.
The first thing was about the minor literature to which we all belong.
Is it enabling to be subterranean or unnoticed in some ways?
You know, I was writing this essay called "The Writer as Tramp" for a seminar, and I was exploring the whole idea of anonymity. And being anonymous is a greatly enabling thing for a writer. And I had not quite understood it but then I started reading a writer, an Australian writer, and he says that the best years of his life, he's now very well known, but the best years of his life were when he was an anonymous writer, what he calls a secret writer. Because then he was a secret writer, he was free of the anxiety of publication. And if you're a secret writer, and the other great advantage of being an anonymous writer, that others don't come to you wanting comments on their work. There are two huge advantages. They don't come asking for blurbs, and they say, please could you read this, and please could you tell me how good it is. And he almost talks about these two things in the same breath. You know, that you have. So I think part of being this English language poetry tradition, that there are no prizes to be won, there are no books to sell, you know, unlike Benjamin, we are not going to sell 100,000 copies of anything. Our editions are limited to 500, 700 copies. Kiran Nagarkar was saying that his first novel took him 27 years to sell, of 1,000 copies. And at the end of it, the charge was that he bought all 1,000 himself. So that is how minor this literature can be. So you are virtually working in an anonymous kind of a field. It has been getting some attention now, because you know, there are Rosinka herself is doing a major anthology, you know, critical writings on Indian writing in English, and a couple of other scholars have started doing it. And Bruce King, of course, did it many years ago. So now it is taking on the semblance of a literature, but still, you know, it's a very small thing, and everyone knows everyone else. About the other thing, about the question of authenticity and the two languages, having the presence of the other language is not there to give authenticity. It is just, if language is a window on the world, the other language gives you another window on the world. So, and it's always better to have two windows looking out than to have one window. That is in that sense I meant.
One last question, maybe? Final question from anybody? If not, oh yeah, okay, there's one last question coming up.
the situation now and the prospects for Indian and South Asian poetry in English?
Yeah, it's very difficult for me to say what the future is like, but I think there will always be poets, and there have been, and new poets, old poets who have been written in the subcontinent who wrote about, you're talking about Suravardi, people who were written 30, 40, 50 years ago, no one knows who they are. So some of those, Eunice D'Souza has done an anthology, early Indian poetry in English. We don't even know. We haven't even looked at Sarojini Toru Dutt's French poems. She did over 100 poems in French, 300 poems in French. No one has even touched those. So there is both literature in the in the 19th century and in the through the 20th of which is unmapped. So there will always be poets, and they will be producing books of poems. As you said, there may be some very good things in P. Lal, or the hundreds of volumes he published. No one has actually ever looked at them and decided, well, should we keep some of this? Should we bring it back? Now the problem is that there is, since we do not have a literary culture, what we have is a culture of celebrity. That is, so everyone goes to the Jaipur Literature Festival and everyone becomes famous. Now, so somehow some of this writing in English, fashion designing, film stars, Bollywood, it's all got a little mixed up. And writing a novel, is like carrying a Gucci bag or whatever it is. You see, writing a novel is a fashion accessory. I'm saying anyone who's fashionable has to write. I'm working on a novel. You meet anyone? No, I do a bit of writing. So it's a bit of, but within this rubbish that goes along all the time, it's an upper middle class game, because if you're writing in English, you belong to a certain social background, so all of that. But within that, there are a few, there will be the occasional good book of poems. The sad thing is that there is no way for that book of poems to enter any cultural discourse. That's it's a good book of poems. A few poets will point it out. Maybe a few friends will point it out. There is no way of a book, once it's published, whether it's a novel or a book of poems, there is no way for it to come back into any kind of, because there is no discourse for it to come back into. So the worry is not that good poems will not be written or new books, but we will lose them. And we will continue to lose them till we have a literary culture, or at least important critics and journals, where these things are constantly being talked about and brought back into discussion.
Arvind, since we haven't been evicted, I'm going to take advantage of the fact, ask you a question to end this, coming out of your response to Kaiser. That is, you just talked about Toru Dutt, others. So I just want to ask you about your rejection of Toru Dutt when you were editing that anthology. We can't do business with these people. We have to. The poetry goes back to Nissim Ezekiel. That's it. No one beyond that. Then your change of opinion, and you decide that no, there was something important over there. They weren't only poetasters or whatever. By the way, you want to ask something?
Yes.
So let's combine the two questions, and then that's it. Yeah.
Mr. Poet, I just want to know, you are in 3 days here in Dhaka, Bangladesh. What is your opinion about your lit festival?
Oh, well, I think I've given to several TV channels. You just watch them over the next 2 days.
You answered that question. Yeah. So do you want to just quickly respond?
No, the literary festival has been very nice. I just wanted to see a bit of Dhaka, and that I have not been able to do. So the festival would have been much more fun, though Benjamin and I are thinking of going out in a little while. So let's hope we can do that.
And Toru Dutt, the recuperation.
Toru Dutt.
Your change of...
one makes mistakes. So the Toru Dutt thing was an error made at a time when there was no internet. Now you must also see that realize that in South Asia we work without libraries. And there was I could have gone to a library and read Toru Dutt. So I was actually making that statement, having read, not very carefully, Ancient Ballads and Legends of Hindustan. So that is the book one had lying around the house. And I looked at a few pages of that. No, this is some sort of Puranic folk tale being retold or whatever, and I dismissed it out of hand. So that was a mistake on my part, because I had not really looked at the 19th century with any seriousness. For one, I was too young, and I was too, and I wanted to make these statements. I just wanted to call white white and black black, and even at the risk of probably thinking that you may be doing making a wrong statement, or statement you will have to retract. And of course, at the first opportunity, when I realized that there was much more to Toru Dutt, I was able to retract that statement and look at her French poetry in some detail, without knowing French, of course, but with the help of friends, I was able to. So I think I made a mistake, and I've made...
No, I wouldn't put it in those terms of making mistakes. I think
in the sense of discovery.
I think,
sometimes you don't discover things at the right.
I think that's very important in a reader and a critic.
That some things which were undiscovered by me. So I was making that statement on the basis of what I knew at the time. But then as you grow and as you read more, as more books become available through the internet largely, then you sort of basically you rediscover Toru Dutt in a very different way.
Well, I mean, so that to conclude, I mean, I would say that is kind of evidence of the fact that you have continued to be, in a way, a youthful critic of constantly learning, constantly discovering, even now, and that's what makes you what you are, your unique place in modern Indian letters. I'm afraid I have to end it here, but it's been a privilege to have this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming on this warm afternoon. Thanks.